The Shining is an absolute masterpiece by Stephen King that received 3 screen adaptations, if you count the sequel with Ewan McGregor. The first one, worshipped. The second one, laughed at. And the third one, which ended the decades-long conflict between Stephen King's work and Stanley Kubrick movie. Yes, passions ran hot for almost 40 years. What happened? In this video, I'll tell the ultimate history of The Shining, details of how the novel was made and every adaptation of it, theories about the hidden meaning, and the dramatic story of this franchise's development, full of rises and falls. Hi, this is ElevenSlate and the ultimate history of The Shining. The novel The Shining came out in 1977 and became Stephen King's first true hit. Carrie and Salem's Lot, published before it, sold decently, but far from the success of The Shining. Before the horrors of the Overlook Hotel, the acceleration of the writer's popularity was set by film adaptations of his work. The first, Carrie, was directed by the excellent Brian De Palma and even received 2 acting Oscar nominations. Sissy Spacek for the title role of Carrie, and Piper Laurie for supporting actress as her mother. Salem's Lot, being a fairly simple entertainment vampire novel, merited only a small TV adaptation. But Stephen King couldn't even imagine what would happen with his next work, what impact it would have not only in book form, but also in cinema. His first 2 published works were set in New England. To be precise, the events took place in King's home state of Maine. Any fan of this writer feels at home there. But for his next work, Stephen King decided to change the setting. He spread a map of the U.S. on the table, poked a finger at random, and hit the city of Boulder, Colorado. There, he and his wife Tabitha stayed at the Stanley Hotel, the place where The Shining was born. A huge number of details from the King's trip formed the basis of his novel, and I'm not talking only about interior details. The writer ended up there close to the off-season, and throughout the hotel the only guests were he and his wife. The Kings dined in an empty hall with musicians playing just for them.
Boy, I bet you we could really have a good party in this room, huh?
Surreal feeling of an empty, almost abandoned but functioning hotel, filled with staff as unnoticed as ghosts. So too, the Torrance family in The Shining found itself cut off from civilization in an empty hotel. Of course, in Stephen King's hotel there were no ghosts, but there were worse things, uniting the image of the unraveling Jack from his novel and the writer himself. But it's early for that. We'll get there in a few minutes. When The Shining saw the light, it was a thunderous success that finally cemented King's name among the most influential young American authors. And one morning, while the writer was shaving, the phone rang. His excited wife handed King the receiver with the words, "Stanley Kubrick is calling." Now let's move to the UK. Eminent director Stanley Kubrick couldn't find a work on which to base his new film. In 1975, his historical drama, Barry Lyndon, came out and flopped at the box office, despite earning 4 Oscars. Over his career, he made many notable films. 2001: A Space Odyssey, with its enormous grosses, untied the director's hands, giving him the opportunity to choose the base for his next picture carefully and without haste. Imagine this. Every film by Stanley Kubrick starting from his first truly major, The Killing, in 1956 was an adaptation. As his secretary recalls, Kubrick sat in his office all day reading various books, the best job in the world. And roughly every 50 pages, a thump came from his office. The director would throw another book against the wall that didn't meet expectations. But at some point, his office fell quiet for a long time. Stanley Kubrick was reading The Shining. The rights issues were resolved quickly, and the genius set to developing his next film, which would insult Stephen King, be coolly received by the public, and even earn 2 Golden Raspberry nominations. But years later, it would enter critics' top lists, become a true classic of horror films, and be quoted for decades. Although in truth, it's not exactly a horror film. Why? All in good time. But first, a bit of conspiracy. Rumors, theories, and urban legends swirl around the filming of Kubrick's The Shining. I won't dwell on each one, but some can't be ignored. My favorite, of course, is tied to the moon landing. Yes, we've all heard the version that Kubrick actually filmed the Apollo 11 landing in 1969. Believe it or not, your call. As with a flat Earth, no judgment. And through The Shining, Kubrick supposedly decided to confess his fraud. He put an Apollo 11 sweater on little Danny. He changed the number of the cursed room from 217, as in the book, to 237. Know why? Because that's roughly how many thousand miles there are from Earth to the moon. And the text Jack Nicholson's character typed over and over begins with the word all, which looks a lot like A11, close to Apollo 11. Through the image of Jack Torrance, he reveals Kubrick's own emotions, forced to keep a great secret and going mad from the tension.
That the owners have placed their complete confidence and trust in me, and that I have signed a letter of agreement, a contract.
A theory marvelous in its convolutions. The crew speaks of Kubrick's merciless perfectionism, forcing dozens of takes of a single scene, and humiliating actress Shelley Duvall to push her into a terrified condition, tuning her to the same wavelength as Wendy, a woman forced to fight her husband who has lost his mind. These facts are well known, but much more interesting here is the result. A film that literally was ahead of its time and broke many cinematic rules. Let's start with the setup, just a bit. I don't think anyone will be surprised. Failed writer Jack Torrance, played by Jack Nicholson, takes a job as caretaker at the Overlook Hotel. He brings along his wife Wendy, Shelley Duvall, and unusual son Danny, played by Danny Lloyd. I'm almost sure the casting of this boy is tied to his name. It's easier for child actors to respond to their own names than to build a whole new complex persona around themselves. Anyway, Danny shines.
How'd you like some ice cream, Doctor?
That is, he has extrasensory abilities. He can read minds, see ghosts, and even feed the supernatural surroundings with his talent. More precisely, that was the case in the book, but we'll talk about differences between Kubrick's Shining and the original in a separate block of my story. In the hotel, Jack goes mad, tries to kill his family, but his axe only catches the cook Dick Halloran, another Shiner. In terms of story, the film is simple as can be. Sort of the Amityville horror, about ghosts turning the head of the family against his loved ones. It's all in the form. We'll hold off on deep subtext for now. For now. Filming The Shining ran from May 1978 through April 79, almost a year. And that's not counting post-production, editing, sound mixing, and so on. Releasing The Shining was a titanic labor. More work was poured into every frame than into many mediocre pictures in their entirety. Smooth passes through Overlook's halls, first filled with staff, then ominously empty. Note the actor playing Manager Ullman. His name is Barry Nelson, and he was the first actor to play James Bond on screen in 1954's TV adaptation of Casino Royale. Yes, Sean Connery was not the first. The shots of Danny riding his trike were made using the breakthrough Steadicam technology of the time, which prevented shake and created maximally smooth images. The opening aerial over Colorado's beauty alone already deserves every accolade. And together with the ominous melody by Wendy Carlos and Rachel Elkind, the viewer slowly sinks into the atmosphere of a melancholy, lonely journey by a little Volkswagen. Fun fact, that opening scene really impressed Ridley Scott, and he asked for unused fragments from that shoot to insert into the so-called happy ending of Blade Runner. Yes, that film has several endings, but more on that in a separate video. We'll definitely get to the replicants with Dick Deckard. For now, that one version of Blade Runner ends with footage shot for The Shining. Back to Kubrick's meticulousness. Let's look at this seemingly simple moment. For the ball to roll exactly as the director envisioned took about 50 takes. What is that? Genius creating a great film or obsessive-compulsive disorder? There's probably no unambiguous answer. Practically every frame contains the color red, which is known to stir anxiety in most viewers. The Shining doesn't scare with classic jump scares. It tries to force the viewer into a state close to the character's feelings. Color palette, angles, ominous sounds, and sharp cutting do the work. Say, a cut from a flood of elevator blood to Danny's frightened face. When Kubrick created the trailer, he of course put that famous bloody scene into it. It turned out too well. Only, there was a big problem. The trailer was going to get an age restriction and have its theatrical runs cut back. So Kubrick simply said it was rusty water. Surprisingly, the fib worked. The trailer got a green, not adult tag. Numerous film scholars dissect The Shining every which way, trying to understand how the film works. Take this scene. Wendy realizes Jack has been typing the same phrase for months instead of a novel. By the way, just like Kubrick's secretary, who had to hand type hundreds of sheets as props, the most obvious choice would be to suddenly reveal Jack over Wendy's shoulder. The perfect setup for any jump scare. Something leaps from behind and the viewer screams, but Stanley Kubrick works completely differently. The camera stands behind Wendy, then shows us Jack. The only one who will start at his appearance is the heroine herself.
How do you like it?
Why waste a good jump scare? Scholars suggest this logic. First, after any sharp scare comes relief. That's how we're built. If you shock the viewer now, the rest of the scene, which in theory is full of tension, will pass less nervously. Second, using Jack as a jump scare here would devalue Dick Halloran's death later. The scene of Nicholson's sudden appearance would repeat and no longer hit as hard. No surprise Kubrick worked this moment dozens of times, game planning all variants to achieve the one ideal. It's no wonder many critics scolded the director for inexperience in the horror genre. And that's true. Stanley Kubrick had never worked in horror. The closest he came was the tense standoff with HAL 9000 in 2001.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me. And I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
So he doesn't follow the genre's traditional rules. No jump scares or flashy gore. He presses with atmosphere, roughly what modern elevated horror does. That is, if The Shining came out now, it would easily stand beside, say, Hereditary, The Witch, and other post-horrors, and would likely be taken for granted. Only it came out in 1980, seriously baffling unprepared audiences. To this day, The Shining is listed among the scariest films ever, though not all cinephiles agree. Because The Shining isn't horror in the usual sense. It can frighten with its atmosphere, which you need to sink into, preferably in the darkness of a theater. The film just plays by different rules and creates a unique viewing experience. That's why it landed so contentiously then and is considered an exemplar now. We'll soon talk about the film's true meaning. For now, to confirm the anti-horror direction, remember the Room 237 scene? The dead lady doesn't jump from the bath, she rises slowly, creating total tension. Another curious fact, both the actress who played the young ghostly woman and the one who played her older version have exactly one film on their resumes, The Shining. Yes, it's their first and last time on screen. Kubrick's film doesn't emphasize the Overlook's history as the novel does. So, we don't learn exactly what happened in Room 237, but in the film you can see a small nod to the original book. When the hotel hall fills with ghosts from the past, at one table you can spot a lady casting a contemptuous glance at Jack. She looks very much like the bathtub ghost. She sits next to a young man who is very similar to the one Wendy will catch, communing with a dog. In the novel, the woman died because her young lover ran off. Likely a similar situation here, only the guy was caught in a more extravagant betrayal. And the cursed room's number changed to 237 not because of conspiracy theories, but for a pretty simple reason. Though most of The Shining was filmed at a London studio, the exterior was based on Oregon's Timberline Lodge. Its owners asked for the number to be changed because Room 217 does exist in that hotel and could gain a bad reputation, whereas 237 does not. That's how it was agreed.
Anything you say, Lloyd. Anything you say.
Decades later, The Shining still sparks fierce debates among film scholars over the film's true meaning. Surely the master didn't just tell of a man going mad and stop there. One of the most popular theories is a critique of the extermination of Native Americans. To justify the hotel's paranormal status, Kubrick added this line.
The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
That's what people grabbed onto. The Overlook is decorated with tribal art, stands on a burial ground, and consists of a never-ending party literally taking place atop the bones of the land's former inhabitants. Characters don't choose their words about other races and don't hide their condescension.
White man's burden, Lloyd, my man. White man's burden.
Another simpler theory, the Overlook is purgatory testing the Torrance family, who didn't make it to the hotel and died on the road during the opening scene, or a bit later after the boiler explosion. As a result, Wendy and Danny managed to go on to a better world, while Jack remained trapped in the Overlook. For example, why does Grady say this to Jack then?
But you are the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker.
And they could escape thanks to Dick Halloran, another psychic who sent his soul on a metaphorical journey to the Afterlife Hotel. Two curious inconsistencies also nag theorists. Listen to how manager Ullman names the previous caretaker who killed his family.
My predecessor in this job hired a man named Charles Grady.
And now what he himself says when meeting Jack.
Grady, sir. Delbert Grady.
Why different names? Or this moment.
He came up here with his wife and two little girls who I think about 8 and 10.
From the dialogue, it's absolutely clear the girls are of different ages, yet they're played by twin actresses who look extremely alike. What is that? An error by a director fixated on visual splendor who overlooks such discrepancies, or a clue to The Shining's hidden meaning? There's a theory many characters have two versions: permanent residents of the hotel and their modern doubles facing a choice: take the path of evil and remain at the Overlook's endless party, or overcome their vices. How do Grady's daughters fit that? Tough question. Thus, there are two Jack Torrances: the one who arrived with his family in the late 70s, and the smiling fellow in the photo from 1921, the one who exists in the hotel forever. By the way, Jack Nicholson's face was composited onto a real photo from that era. Here's the original. Kubrick considered shooting a new stylized picture, but likely couldn't have matched the period feel so well. I think the actors were relieved. Imagine how many attempts it would have taken to create that shot. I believe Kubrick and King's Shining, despite huge differences, share the same central subtext: a struggle with alcoholism. In the book, ending in a kind of victory; in the film, with a crushing defeat. Jack Torrance has been sober 5 months, but under stress and an unceasing thirst, he literally sells his soul for alcohol.
My goddamn soul. Just a glass of beer.
A gag that lets evil burst into Jack's body and make him lose control. Some analysts even see all the hotel terrors as Jack's hallucinations and the product of little Danny's vivid imagination. So no mysticism at all. Which could be, if not for the pantry moment. Grady's ghost lets Jack out.
I give you my word.
Of course, you can argue that a rattled Wendy failed to latch the pantry properly, so Jack got out with no ghostly help. But that devalues Danny's extrasensory gifts. So it's simple. A cornered alcoholic sells his soul to a dark force lurking in a hotel built on an ancient burial ground and sets out to kill his son, the source of the supernatural energy the ghosts crave, as in the film and the book. But if the core subtext is so similar, why did Stephen King dislike Kubrick's Shining? That's simple too. First and foremost, it's Jack Nicholson. Because, essentially, Jack Torrance is Stephen King. As I said earlier, the author and his character share much more than a stay in a similar hotel. In the mid-70s, the writer became addicted to alcohol. Soon other substances joined in. King himself says he remembers absolutely nothing about how some of his books were written then. He drank, constantly suffered hangovers, and even nearly snapped at his kids. The Shining is the writer's confession, subconscious repentance for his behavior. A story about an author going through similar problems, facing the paranormal, losing himself, but in the end resisting his addiction and the demons pushing him to the dark side. In the book, Jack Torrance comes to his senses and lets his son go, and then dies near the overloaded boiler. In the film. And back to our earlier point, another rule-breaking moment: no spectacular dispatch of the main villain, as horror convention dictates. Jack from the book is a good man who loves his family, but is broken by addiction. In Nicholson's performance, he seems unhinged from the start. Just look how sweet and friendly he is with his family.
Boy, they must really be high up. The air feels so different.
He receives no redemption and becomes a prisoner of alcohol. Though in King's version, he should get a chance to make amends, because the writer himself wants that chance. See, in the already mad, cold Jack Nicholson turn into a true monster without the right to forgiveness, Stephen King took a blow to his subconscious sense of dignity, to his hope for redemption. It wasn't Jack Torrance who froze in the maze, it was Stephen King himself.
Words of wisdom, Lloyd. Words of wisdom.
If you read the original novel, you'll notice the direct horror elements begin roughly halfway through. Before that, we see the life story of a man battling alcoholism. So, The Shining is less a horror story than a social drama about domestic violence. Now, suddenly, remember friends, there was an episode where Joey kept The Shining in the freezer, calling it the scariest novel of his life.
I mean, I never start reading The Shining without making sure we got plenty of room in the freezer.
I never believed that. Not that The Shining isn't scary. The novel can seriously give you chills, but that Joey Tribbiani, with his attention span, could reach the terrifying parts through Jack Torrance's drama. Never mind Jack. At the very beginning, there are several pages describing the boiler's operation in the Overlook's basement. Joey would have quit there.
Oh my God!
Although later he mentions the twins, even though they aren't in the book, and then talks about the exploding boiler. Apparently, the film and the book mixed in his head. So, in Stanley Kubrick's hands, The Shining became visually honed magnificence, filled with viscous atmosphere, but far too distant from the original intent. As Stephen King said, it's like a shining Cadillac without a motor. Beautiful, even flawless to look at, but you can't ride it. And many critics join this view. The Shining received mixed reviews from audiences of the time. They gave it a C+ on CinemaScore polls. Critics praised Nicholson's acting, but saw the film itself as, well, fine. Pure mid-tier with pretty trappings, but without interesting characters or logic.
A little slow tonight, isn't it?
It would be the only major Kubrick film to get no Oscar, Golden Globe, or BAFTA nominations. But it immediately snagged 2 nods from a new award launched in 1981, the Razzies. Kubrick, Worst Director, and Shelley Duvall, Worst Actress. Years later, after learning of the director's harsh treatment of the actress, the Razzies committee removed that nomination from their roster and issued an apology. Amusingly, among the worst director contenders with Kubrick were Brian De Palma, John G. Avildsen, an Oscar winner for the first Rocky, and William Friedkin, himself an Oscar winner for The French Connection. The Razzies opted to kick off by honoring, in their opinion, some of the worst filmmakers. Neither audiences nor critics could figure out what kind of film this was. Nevertheless, it grossed $44 million. After all, it was an adaptation of a King bestseller with a strong ad campaign. Jack Nicholson with an axe is a great selling element. Once, films helped sell King's books. Now the opposite. Only years later, returning to The Shining again and again, perhaps out of sheer stubbornness, did viewers begin to understand the picture. A horror film made by completely different rules, and thus one that didn't work for mass audiences at first. But Stephen King would remain unhappy and continue to bash the film on talk shows. Beyond the core difference in Jack Torrance's portrayal, Kubrick's film left out a huge number of fright bits like the living fire hose or vicious topiary animals clipped from bushes. Fortunately, I won't have to be mere words. There is a chance to confirm every difference between Kubrick's film and the book and footage. Because in 1997, a TV miniseries The Shining came out from a script by Stephen King himself, translating the book's events to the screen very faithfully. Will the author manage to outdo his rival in this new project? Let's find out now. If you compare it to the previous cult film, the difference is night and day. Stephen King couldn't let go of the idea of telling the story of Jack Torrance the right way, preferably in a miniseries format. After the success of the 2-part It with Tim Curry back in 1990, TV adaptations of Stephen King's novels became a common thing. The Stand, 1994, The Tommyknockers, The Langoliers, and now it was time for The Shining. The ABC network, without thinking too long, commissioned the script from the one person who understood the original story better than anyone, Stephen King. Mick Garris, who had already worked with King twice before, was brought on to direct. He had directed Sleepwalkers from King's script and the TV version of The Stand. Although we both understand perfectly well that Stephen King himself closely supervised the production. By the way, here he is playing the ghostly band leader, as if hinting at something to the audience. The miniseries has several interesting cameos from well-known filmmakers. The snowmobile that Dick uses is given to him by none other than Sam Raimi, the director of The Evil Dead and Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, among others. And at the ghostly party, along with Stephen King, you can spot Frank Darabont, the director of The Shawshank Redemption. He came to the set to discuss his next King adaptation, The Green Mile, and stayed to do a small cameo. In the Miami cafe scene, the waitress is Shawnee Smith, Amanda from Saw. And at the AA meeting, you can see Mick Garris himself. And these were just the most recognizable names. Many filmmakers and sci-fi writers were very fond of Stephen King and dropped by the set just to hang out. So, Stephen King and Mick Garris set out to challenge Stanley Kubrick himself. While Kubrick's film was received coldly at release, over the years it became a cult classic, worshipped by critics and audiences. Competing with that required real effort, but Stephen King wasn't afraid. He believed that his understanding of Jack Torrance's story was more appealing to general audiences than a madman with an axe. By the way, where did the axe even come from? In the book, it wasn't like that at all, but we'll get to that. The main roles went to Rebecca De Mornay as Wendy and Steven Weber as Jack Torrance. and finding someone willing to play Jack was extremely difficult. No one wanted to be compared to Jack Nicholson's legendary performance. A new actor would lose that comparison 99% of the time. For example, Gary Sinise, best known as Lieutenant Dan from Forrest Gump, turned a role down. In the end, just days before filming, Rebecca De Mornay recommended Steven Weber, a very versatile actor who had done everything from comedy to heavy drama.
Now she's dead.
No, she's not.
She's alive?
She's Nosferatu.
She's Italian?
And with enough courage to step into a role forever linked to Nicholson. Before production, Stephen King hit one snag. The rights were still owned by Warner Brothers, the studio that released Kubrick's film. Surprisingly, the studio agreed to cooperate, but on one condition. King had to stop publicly criticizing Kubrick's version. Naturally, he agreed. He had already said everything he wanted to say. The main filming location chosen was the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, the very same hotel where the King family stayed in the 70s, inspiring the novel. But that came with challenges. The Overlook was supposed to be buried in snow, yet that winter there was almost no snowfall in that part of Colorado. They had to pay for artificial snow. And the real hotel isn't isolated. If you turn the camera the wrong way, you'll see the nearby town. So the production team had to be very careful with angles. ABC ordered 3 1.5-hour episodes, about 4.5 hours total. That's more than twice as long as Kubrick's film. King decided to recreate the events of his novel in full detail, and the miniseries format made that possible. Now let's talk about the differences between Kubrick's Shining and the original novel using the miniseries as an example. Remember Tony, Danny's imaginary friend, or as Danny said himself,
"No, he's a little bit lives in my mouth."
A very unclear explanation. In the 1980 film, it's never really explained who Tony is, good or evil. And the way Danny portrays him makes him seem like some kind of demon.
I don't want to call them Mrs. Torrance.
But in the book, Tony appeared in the form of a real person, and as we later learn, he's Danny from the future warning his younger self.
Hi, Doc.
Hi, Tony.
Now Tony returns in his original form. Although a floating teenager in glasses doesn't exactly build tension on screen, which is likely why Kubrick changed him. The same applies to several scare moments from the novel. When King stayed at the Stanley in the 70s, he was struck by the fire hose in the hallway and compared it to a snake. It was written that way in the book and recreated in the miniseries. Yes, CGI doesn't always help. The same goes for the animal-shaped topiary. In the book, the Overlook's grounds had hedged animals that came alive when you weren't looking, like the weeping angels in Doctor Who. Kubrick removed them entirely, deciding that the special effects of the time couldn't make them convincing. Instead, he created the hedge maze. King, in the miniseries, tried to show what he originally intended, and even almost 2 decades later, the special effects still couldn't make the figures look truly threatening. And I doubt that would be any different even today. There are things that look terrifying on the page because the reader's imagination does the work, but should never be shown literally. Meanwhile, some of the most iconic scares in Kubrick's film, like the elevator of blood, the Grady twins, and here's Johnny, were never in the novel at all. Those were Kubrick's creations. Moving to the characters, Shelley Duvall can only be sympathized with. She endured a year of emotional pressure from Kubrick and was then mocked by the public. One can argue endlessly about whether Kubrick's methods were justified or whether artists should understand boundaries. Today, many people praise her performance, but her Wendy is extremely beaten down, which is exactly what Kubrick wanted.
Why don't you start right now and get the out of here?
He wanted to show a victim of domestic abuse unable to fight back. She spends most of the film screaming and swinging a weapon without intent. Wendy, as played by Rebecca De Mornay, has a stronger will and refuses to be intimidated by the cursed hotel.
You shut up. You can't hurt me.
In the book, she constantly considered divorce, but Jack quitting drinking saved their marriage. Now, let's talk about Jack. In the miniseries, as in the novel, a huge amount of time is spent exploring Jack's character, his temper, alcoholism, and despite it all, his desire to do better. This Jack is a good husband and father, flawed but trying. And he likely would have succeeded if not for the hotel's supernatural influence. By the way, that's actually a pretty decent excuse for a relapsing alcoholic. I'd love not to drink, but the ghosts are to blame. Steven Weber captures the transformation from a kind man to a possessed monster.
There you are, Doc. Been looking for you.
Now, let's take a look at Jack Nicholson at the end of The Shining and at the beginning.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Stay away from me!
Wendy.
Stay away!
Darling, light of my life.
And 5 months of peace is just what I want.
He was a spawn of hell from the very beginning. The portrayal of Jack Torrance is truly the strongest element of the miniseries. His downfall is tragic, yet there is hope in it. To highlight Jack's struggle, King also changed the ending. In the novel, Jack goes to the boiler room and dies when it explodes, but he's already lost by then. In the miniseries, he regains control and sacrifices himself to destroy the evil.
What are you doing? Are you crazy? I was. But I'm better now.
And then he appears years later at Danny's graduation. We learn Danny's full name, Anthony, and the actor playing Tony turns out to be the same actor playing adult Danny. King wanted to make Tony's identity obvious. Too bad Danny's future won't be as bright as this scene promises. We'll talk about that when we get to the sequel. The miniseries contains a slightly different hint at a possible continuation. At the very end, we're shown that the Overlook is being prepared for reconstruction, which means the evil has not been defeated. Pay attention. Sitting next to Wendy at the graduation ceremony is Dick Halloran, who was killed with an axe in Kubrick's film's ending. And this is not a ghost. The thing is, this character survived in the original novel because he wasn't attacked with an axe. The main weapon of the book's Jack was a roque mallet, so Dick gets away with some knocked out teeth and a mild concussion. And believe it or not, this mallet is one of the biggest complaints critics have about the miniseries. Jack with an axe radiates real danger.
Here's Johnny.
But with a mallet, he's beating Wendy relentlessly, yet she continues running just fine. In the novel, the heroine received a serious spinal injury, but the miniseries apparently decided not to hurt her even more.
Yeah, women. Can't live with them, can't kill them.
And these are all the main differences between the two works, Kubrick's and King's. The key difference is that the miniseries is not cinematic. It adapts the story very faithfully. The actors try hard. Jack Torrance finally receives on-screen redemption. But the 90s Shining doesn't look visually interesting. That's just the nature of television formatting. Although the miniseries actually had a larger budget, $21 million compared to Kubrick's $19 million. But here the runtime is longer, and we shouldn't forget about inflation. The funniest part is that the miniseries received more prestigious awards than the 1980 film. 2 Emmys, including one for Best Makeup and a couple of Saturn Awards. One of them for Best Actor went to Steven Weber. Meanwhile, Kubrick's film only got a Saturn Award for Best Supporting Actor for Scatman Crothers. He played Dick Halloran. So in some ways, the miniseries actually performed better than the famous film. And if you don't pay attention to the TV quality visuals and the very drawn-out pacing, this version of The Shining is actually a pretty solid work, showing the story many people only know from Kubrick's movie form a completely different perspective. And most importantly, thanks to this miniseries, years later, Dr. Sleep would appear, the continuation of the story of the now-grown Danny Torrance. And later, a film adaptation would be made, reconciling both versions. How did that happen? I'll tell you right now. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining became more popular year by year. The film gathered fans and, first regarded as a misfire by the great director, became one of his most quoted movies. Everyone wanted to pay homage to it in their own work, starting with The Simpsons, though that's no surprise. Everything was in The Simpsons.
Here's Johnny! Down!
Many iconic beats were mocked in sitcoms, animated parodies, and more. You can even see a kind of blood-filled elevator in the Chinese film Kung Fu Hustle. The Shining entered the cultural code specifically in Kubrick's version, not through King's novel or the miniseries, much as the writer might have wanted otherwise. When Steven Spielberg adapted Ernest Cline's pop culture epic Ready Player One, he made one of the trials, specifically The Shining, as the most influential film of that era.
Hi, naked lady. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your bath time. I know self-care can be important. But can you do me a favor and tell me where are all the exits?
But Stephen King considered his vision, realized in the miniseries, the only correct one, and he thought about a continuation of the story. Once, at a fan event, someone asked him how Danny's life turned out after the Overlook. That question from a reader was prompted by the miniseries ending with the grown-up hero and Tony's guys. King joked that he was doing fine and married Charlie McGee, the heroine of Firestarter. And then he thought, well, actually, why not tell about a grown-up Danny who keeps shining in everyday life? In the late 2000s, Stephen King held a poll on his website. What should he write next? A side story from his monumental Dark Tower cycle, later published as The Wind Through the Keyhole, or a continuation of The Shining. Readers chose Danny Torrance. In 2013, the novel Dr. Sleep went to press and told about the grown-up hero, who naturally followed in his father's footsteps. Alcoholism and aggressive behavior are in place. He has to face a new threat, the True Knot, a group of evil long-livers who feed on the energy of those who shine. As they call it, steam. The steam is especially nourishing if the victim experiences maximum fear and pain before death. In short, some real monsters. Danny will fight inner demons and save from the outer ones Abra, a girl with a record level of shining.
Abracadabra.
Filmmakers immediately thought about a screen adaptation of the novel. Dr. Sleep was well received by the public and even called the writer's best novel in many years. Oscar-winning writer Akiva Goldsman wrote a script and no one made the film. King adaptations weren't bringing in the necessary profits. And then It with Bill Skarsgård happened and became the most profitable horror in history. The studios took that as a sign to launch a slew of films based on King's works. Among them was Dr. Sleep. They entrusted it to Mike Flanagan, a director of solid horror movies. For example, Oculus, Hush, and the wonderful series The Haunting of Hill House. And in 2017, he brought to the screen another of the author's works, Gerald's Game, about Carly Gugino handcuffed to a bed. Flanagan himself wrote a new version of the script, at once close to the source and very far from it, because a tough problem arose in front of him. The Shining has two camps of devotees, cinephiles who adore Stanley Kubrick's version and everyone else, for whom the psychology of the original novel is closer. And he needed to please everyone, make a sequel to the 1980 film, but pay respect to the writer who, though he'd stopped openly trash-talking the classic chiller, still didn't much love it. Flanagan wanted to bring back the Overlook, which on screen remained intact, reproduce many details from Kubrick's film, and stuff his Dr. Sleep with a bunch of references, but King was against it. In his universe, the hotel burned to the ground. Then the director came up with a very curious way to placate the king of horror and honor Kubrick, marry these two largely different works. How exactly? Oh, this is interesting. They cast popular actor Ewan McGregor as the grown-up Danny. A big name was supposed to help the marketing. And moreover, the character shared one trait with the actor. McGregor, too, once had serious problems with alcohol, which means he could credibly convey the doubts of a dependent person. And the experience from Danny Boyle's train spotting confirmed the right choice. The main villain, Rose the Hat, was played by Rebecca Ferguson, who would become a mega popular actress in the late 2010s.
Are you gonna hurt me?
And of course, the film included a great many actors who had already appeared in Mike Flanagan's past projects. He really loves working with familiar performers. The True Knot, aside from Ferguson and John McLarnon, who plays Crow Daddy, consists entirely of actors from the director's earlier works. But the most notable role went to Henry Thomas, Flanagan's constant collaborator. If you didn't recognize him, that's the grown-up little boy Elliot from E.T., the extraterrestrial. Now he had the honor of playing Jack Nicholson.
The mind is a blackboard, and this is the eraser.
Yes, imagine. The sweet Elliot and the crazed Jack Torrance were played by the same actor. And you might think that this is what Mike Flanagan used to win over Stephen King. Maybe in his film, Jack would help his son from the afterlife and save Abra from the villains? Unfortunately, no. This Jack cannot be saved. A very important aspect of The Shining, completely missed by Kubrick, and of Dr. Sleep can be called relationships with the father and the problems of a person may have after a traumatic childhood experience. In the book and miniseries, Jack regularly remembered and even heard his abusive parent. He hated him and at the same time followed in his footsteps.
You're dead! And I don't have to listen!
The same happened to Danny. He kept running from his past, drawing closer to the figure of Jack Torrance. In the book, he managed to save Abra, quit bad habits, and with the help of his father's spirit, become the kind of son one can be proud of, but on screen. let's look once more at Nicholson's friendly face before the insanity.
Don't worry, Mom. I know all about cannibalism. I saw it on TV.
See? It's okay.
The question arises, was there a before the insanity? His full redemption would look strange. So Dan took on Jack's role and repeated his book fate. Mike Flanagan worked the ending of the original novel into his film's finale, placing in the role of the crazed father with an axe the character played by McGregor. Now Dan becomes possessed by the hotel, then comes to his senses and lets Abra go, and dies in front of the overpressurized boiler. All that his father did on the page. In the book, the main character survived and continued to keep in touch with the girl as a kindly uncle. Yes, on the page, Danny really was Abra's blood uncle. Jack Torrance, in his alcoholic past, stepped out on the side and started another shining lineage.
I'm Abra Stone, and if anyone asks, you're my uncle.
On screen, Dan dies, atoning for his father's sins. He shows that a person doesn't have to go down a predestined path and follow the nearest role model. Each builds their own life. This is where Stephen King's heart melted, and Mike Flanagan got full carte blanche for references to the 1980 Shining. And there are a lot of them in the film. The crew meticulously recreated the sets from Kubrick's plans. The interior, though time-worn, instantly triggers flashbacks to the cult film. The same goes for reshot moments with Danny on the trike or Wendy hiding from Jack as he breaks down the door. At first, they considered using CGI, compositing faces, or even digitally recreating the characters, but decided that casting other actors would work much better. If you look at Dick Halloran, you can find minimal differences between the new actor's manner and the originals. As you recall, he survived in a book and, at the beginning of Dr. Sleep, acted as Danny's mentor. But in Kubrick's version, the question with him was settled definitively. They handled this problem simply. He appears as a ghost.
Whoa, hang on, Doc.
Mike Flanagan tried to persuade Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall to do cameos, but they remained firm in their decision to leave acting and declined. But Danny Lloyd, the boy from Kubrick's film, did make it into the movie. There he is on the baseball field. Lloyd didn't pursue an acting career and chose to teach biology at a college. This was his first screen appearance in a full 37 years. The scene with the camera flying over Colorado landscapes came straight from Kubrick's film, and those are the very same shots, just darkened and dusted with snow in post. In the end, Danny continued to accompany Abra as a spirit, and the Overlook finally met the fate it had in the book. Kubrick's and King's versions resonated thanks to Mike Flanagan. Only Dr. Sleep didn't find a response from audiences. No, don't get me wrong, it had excellent reviews. Critics moderately praised it, and regular viewers gave it 89% freshness on Rotten Tomatoes. They just weren't in a hurry to go to the theater. With a budget of $45 million, the film grossed $72 million at the box office, and that's very little. Dr. Sleep is poorly suited to entertaining theatrical viewing. It's largely a faithful adaptation, consisting of dialogue and well-chosen scenes from the book, 2.5 hours long. It's literally a synthesis of Kubrick's Shining, with lots of excellently staged scenes, and King's miniseries with persistent, even slightly tedious faithfulness to the original. In that same 2019, It Chapter 2 and The New Pet Sematary made significantly more than Flanagan's film, despite noticeably lower approval from critics and viewers. Because audience approval and critical success are not equivalent to box office gross. Along with the shortfall at the box office, the studio instantly canceled 2 Shining follow-ups. Yes, the story of the Cursed Hotel was one step away from becoming a full-fledged franchise with a bunch of spin-offs, crossovers, and so on. For example, in 2018, King's anthology Castle Rock began airing, and one of its central roles was played by Jackie Torrance, the niece of that very Jack. At the end, she went off to investigate the Overlook and her family's history, heavily hinting at a sequel.
Overlooked? Who's overlooked?
But the show was canceled after its second season and never got to finish that story. Though that event wasn't related to Dr. Sleep, we couldn't pass it by. Warner Brothers, they handled production on Flanagan's film, planned another Shining expansion. First, a prequel about the cook Dick Halloran, how he used his abilities before meeting the Torrances. Unfortunately, the plot details are unknown, but surely it would have been something like the series The Bear, only with psychics in the lead roles.
What the f did you say?
However, Dick Halloran plays one of the central roles in the series It, Welcome to Derry. It turns out that before starting his culinary career, the Shining Dick served in the army and helped the military track down Pennywise. This storyline grows out of a small fragment from the novel It, about the fire at the Black Spot nightclub. The parents of one of the members of the Losers Club, Mike Hanlon, were saved from the fire thanks to a cameo appearance by Dick Halloran. This scene was expanded, giving the character a chance to confront Pennywise face to face. As a result, this leads to the end of his military service and his move to the hotel, where he takes a job as a cook.
I think I'll manage. I mean, how much trouble can a hotel be?
In the future, I'll talk in detail about all adaptations of It in a separate video. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. The second expansion of the franchise was a direct sequel about the growing Abra, but the studio lost interest in it as well. Then J.J. Abrams began developing the series Overlook about the cursed hotel's past, but that project also didn't take off. There was a moment when Abrams was paid a lot of money for 3 series, but he managed to deliver only one, Duster with Josh Holloway, which was canceled after 1 season. And for now, silence. But we can be sure that such a famous story as The Shining will find its place on screens again, especially in our postmodern times, when much of cinema consists of remakes, reimaginings, and soft reboots. The history of The Shining's adaptations is astonishing in its drama. The work itself appeared as Stephen King's subconscious reflection on his improper behavior, then fell into Stanley Kubrick's hands to be trampled by the masses, among whom was the original author. Then it received the 1997 miniseries, conceived as a challenge to Kubrick, which gave the author the idea of a continuation. And from that came Mike Flanagan's Dr. Sleep, which combined the visions of both creators, giving this story of slights and conflicts a true happy ending. But despite all disagreements, it's impossible to deny that The Shining is an excellent book and a wonderful, powerful film, and Dr. Sleep is the best sequel possible for this story. Now head over to the next video or check out the playlist packed with deep dives into iconic movies and legendary franchises. Thanks for watching. This was 11 Take.